What if everything you thought you knew about Caitlin Clark was wrong? Not the highlights, not the logo threes, not the sold-out arenas or the record books she shredded. What if the real story, the one nobody wanted to talk about, was that Caitlin Clark didn't just change Iowa basketball, she broke the traditional idea of coaching itself. Because when Lisa Bluder finally said it out loud, the room didn't react the way people expected. She didn't say Caitlin was difficult. She didn't say she was selfish. She didn't say she didn't listen. She said something far more unsettling. Caitlin Clark was impossible to coach, and not in the way fans assume. That sentence alone flips the entire narrative on its head. Because when people hear impossible to coach, they imagine ego, clashes, locker room drama, or rebellion. But none of that fits Caitlin Clark. Teammates rave about her. Coaches defend her. Her work ethic is legendary. So how does a player who does everything right still become the hardest coaching challenge of a Hall of Fame career? That's the part that never makes highlight reels. Behind the cheers and TV segments, Iowa's staff was dealing with something no blueprint prepared them for. A player whose instincts moved faster than instruction, whose understanding of the game outpaced systems, and whose greatness carried a weight that quietly reshaped everyone around her. Because once Caitlin Clark walked into that gym, Iowa wasn't just building a team anymore. They were managing a phenomenon. And the truth is, once that kind of player enters your program, you don't control the story, you survive it. But to understand why Lisa Bluder reached that conclusion, you have to strip away the myth everyone believes. And look at what really happens when a generational talent doesn't fit the mold we built for them. From the outside, Caitlin Clark's Iowa career looks almost laughably simple. Put the ball in her hands. Let her cook. Collect the wins. That's how fans see it. That's how headlines frame it. That's how highlight packages tell the story. A walking cheat code. A once-in-a-generation scorer who made coaching easier, not harder. And for a long time, that illusion worked. Every deep three felt inevitable. Every assist felt effortless. Every night, Iowa looked bigger than the program it had been before she arrived. Attendance exploded. National attention followed. The logo shots became a brand of their own. From the outside, it looked like Lisa Bluder hit the coaching lottery. But inside the program, something else was happening. Because what people don't realize is that when a player becomes the system, everything underneath starts to crack. Coaching isn't just about putting talent on the floor. It's about rhythm, hierarchy, trust, timing, knowing when to slow a game down and when to let it fly. And the moment Caitlin Clark arrived, all of that got complicated fast. Not because she wouldn't listen, but because she didn't need to. That's the part nobody likes to say. Most players arrive needing structure. They need sets. They need boundaries. They need to be taught how to read defenses, how to feel momentum, how to recognize when a possession is slipping away. Caitlin arrived already seeing those things. She wasn't waiting for the game to happen. She was already living 2 plays ahead of it. And that creates a problem no coach is trained for. Because when you call a play, you're asking players to trust the plan. But what happens when your best player already sees a better option before the clipboard is even lowered? What happens when the instinct is faster than instruction? What happens when the right basketball play exists outside the system you spent months building? That's where the myth begins to fall apart. Because coaching Caitlin Clark didn't mean maximizing her talent. It meant constantly negotiating control, not in a confrontational way, but in a philosophical one. Whose vision wins in that moment? The system or the savant? Fans think great players make coaching easier. In reality, they raise the stakes of every decision. Every timeout becomes heavier. Every substitution becomes louder. Every adjustment carries consequences beyond the scoreboard. And at Iowa, that pressure multiplied because Caitlin wasn't just the best player, she was the identity. When Iowa won, it was because of Caitlin. When Iowa lost, it was because of Caitlin. When Iowa struggled, it became a referendum on her choices, her shots, her decisions. That kind of gravity doesn't just pull defenders. It pulls teammates. It pulls coaches. It pulls the entire program into one orbit. And that's where things quietly shift. Because suddenly, you're not just coaching basketball anymore. You're managing expectations. You're protecting confidence. You're balancing freedom with responsibility. And the hardest part? You're doing all of it knowing that if you overcoach her, you limit her. And if you undercoach her, you risk losing everyone else. That tension is invisible to fans. It doesn't show up in box scores or viral clips. But inside the gym, It's felt every single day. Caitlin Clark didn't break Iowa's record books by fitting into a system. She forced the system to bend around her. And once that happens, coaching stops being about teaching plays and starts being about managing something far more fragile. Because the truth is, when a player becomes bigger than the plan, bigger than the playbook, and bigger than the moment, they don't just change the game. They change the rules of leadership itself. And Lisa Bluder was about to learn that the hard way. Starting with the first moments, she realized Caitlin Clark wasn't just special. She was operating on a level that made normal coaching feel obsolete. And that realization would follow them into every practice, every timeout, and every high-pressure moment that came next. The first cracks didn't show up on national television. They didn't happen during sold-out games or record-breaking nights. They didn't come after logo threes or viral highlights. They happened quietly, early, before the country even knew Caitlin Clark's name. Freshman year. That's where Lisa Bluder realized something wasn't adding up. Because Caitlin didn't arrive at Iowa like most freshmen do, wide-eyed, deferential, waiting for permission. She walked in already knowing exactly who she was and how the game worked around her. Not cocky, not dismissive, just ready. And readiness can be unsettling. In college basketball, especially at a program built on structure and discipline, freshmen are expected to absorb before they assert. They learn the system. They learn spacing. They learn patience. They learn when to speak and when to listen. Caitlin skipped straight to the listening part and then quietly moved past it. She didn't challenge authority out loud. She didn't argue in huddles. She didn't roll her eyes when plays were drawn up. She executed. And then she improvised. That's the part people miss. She would run the set exactly as called, and then, in the blink of an eye, deviate from it because she saw something no one else did. A defender leaning half a step too far. A rotation that would be late. A passing lane that technically shouldn't exist, but did. From the bench, it looked like chaos. From the film room, it looked like genius. And that duality is where coaching becomes impossible. Because when a player is wrong, you correct them. When a player is right, you empower them. But what do you do when a player is right in a way that undermines the structure you're responsible for maintaining? That's the paradox Bluder walked into. Early on, there were moments that didn't make highlight reels. Timeouts where a play was drawn, executed, and then abandoned halfway through because Caitlin felt something shift. Possessions where the safe option existed, but Caitlin took the harder, smarter, riskier one. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes it didn't. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Both outcomes made the job harder. When it worked, it validated her instincts. When it didn't, it raised the question of whether freedom was becoming recklessness. But Caitlin wasn't guessing. That's what made it dangerous. She wasn't freelancing because she didn't care. She was freelancing because she understood. An understanding that early creates tension not just with coaches, but with teammates too. Because when one player sees the game faster, the rest of the team feels late. Passes come quicker than expected. Shots happen before defenders are fully engaged. Decisions are made in spaces most players don't even recognize yet. That can be empowering or alienating. And during that freshman season, Iowa was feeling both. Teammates trusted Caitlin. They believed in her. But there were moments where the pace she played at forced everyone else to speed up before they were ready. And that's where Bluder's real concerns started forming. Not is Caitlin too aggressive? But can the team grow fast enough to keep up with her? Because the hardest thing to coach isn't resistance. It's acceleration. Caitlin didn't need to be pulled forward. She needed to be slowed down just enough for everyone else to arrive with her. And slowing down someone like that feels almost wrong. It's like telling lightning to wait. And the more games they played, the clearer it became that Caitlin wasn't just adapting to college basketball. She was bending it. Defenses reacted differently when she crossed half court. Scouting reports ballooned. Coaches stopped treating Iowa like a balanced team and started treating them like a singular threat, which meant every adjustment Iowa faced started with Caitlin. Box and one looks. Extended pressure. Traps designed not just to stop her scoring, but to disrupt her rhythm and decision-making. And Caitlin responded the only way she knew how. She thought harder. She watched more film. She carried more responsibility. That's where the freshman year illusion finally shattered. Because what looks like confidence from the outside can quietly turn into obligation on the inside. Caitlin wasn't just trying to win anymore. She was trying to be right every possession. And that's when Bluder realized something that would define the next 4 years. Caitlin Clark wasn't difficult to coach because she didn't listen. She was difficult to coach because she processed the game faster than the environment around her, and that gap was only growing. Every practice raised the ceiling. Every game widened the distance. Every success made the burden heavier. And as that freshman season unfolded, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't going to be a normal development curve. This was going to be a constant battle between instinct and structure, between freedom and responsibility, between letting Caitlin be Caitlin, and protecting her from becoming something even she couldn't control. And that tension was only getting started. At some point during Caitlin Clark's rise, something subtle but irreversible happened. The playbook stopped being a solution. It became a suggestion. And that's not a criticism. It's the natural consequence of what happens when a player's understanding of the game begins to outgrow the structures designed to contain it. Most offenses are built to create advantages. They rely on timing, spacing, misdirection, all designed to give players windows to operate in. Coaches spend years refining these systems so that in pressure moments, players don't have to think. They just execute. But Caitlin didn't operate in windows. She created them. That's where the real problem emerged. Because the moment a player starts generating advantages before the system is finished unfolding, the system itself becomes redundant. And redundancy in coaching is uncomfortable. Imagine drawing up a set designed to free a shooter on the weak side, only to watch Caitlin identify a defensive imbalance 3 seconds earlier and fire a pass that turns the play into something else entirely. It works. The ball goes in. The crowd explodes. But on the bench, something else happens. The coach is no longer ahead of the action. They're reacting to it. And when that dynamic repeats enough times, authority subtly shifts. Not through confrontation, not through defiance, but through inevitability. Caitlin wasn't waiting for confirmation. She trusted her read more than the diagram, and most of the time, she was right. That's the terrifying part. Because you can correct mistakes. You can rein in selfishness. You can discipline indifference. But how do you fix someone who is outperforming the framework itself? Bluder faced a question few coaches ever encounter. How do you teach someone who already understands more than the lesson? And the answer isn't obvious. Because when you try to simplify the game for a player like Caitlin, you insult her intelligence. When you overstructure it, you suffocate her instincts. When you let her go completely, you risk losing the team. So every possession became a negotiation. Every timeout became a calculation. Do you call something specific, or let her read it? Do you slow the pace, or trust her feel? Do you pull her back, or let her push the boundary again? And none of those decisions are neutral. Because when Caitlin deviates and succeeds, the room absorbs that message. When she deviates and fails, the spotlight magnifies it. Either way, the weight increases. This is where fans misunderstand the phrase, impossible to coach. It doesn't mean she ignored instruction. It means instruction couldn't keep up. Her basketball IQ wasn't just high, it was predictive. She saw rotations before they committed. She recognized mismatches before defenses adjusted. She felt momentum shifts before crowds reacted. And that ability doesn't just elevate performance. It isolates. Because when you see the game differently, you stop experiencing it the same way as everyone else. Teammates are reading cues. Caitlin is reading patterns. Teammates are reacting. Caitlin is anticipating. And slowly, quietly, the mental gap grows. That's where the pressure starts to build, not externally, but internally. Because now Caitlin isn't just responsible for scoring. She's responsible for seeing everything. Every missed rotation. Every late help defender. Every possession that could have gone better. And when you see it all, you start carrying it all. That's the part people never talk about. High basketball IQ isn't just a gift. It's a burden. Because you don't get to turn it off. And Bluder could see that happening. In film sessions, Caitlin would point out breakdowns before anyone else noticed them. In practices, she would adjust on the fly, almost unconsciously correcting spacing or tempo. Not to show off, to fix things. But fixing everything is exhausting. And slowly, the joy that fueled those instincts started to coexist with something darker. Responsibility without relief. Caitlin wasn't just playing the game anymore. She was managing it. And managing the game, while also being the centerpiece of it, is a recipe for overload. Bluder realized she wasn't just coaching execution. She was coaching cognition. How much should Caitlin see? How much should she carry? How much should she be allowed to shoulder before it starts costing her something deeper? Because there's a line where brilliance stops being playful and starts being heavy. And Caitlin was crossing it faster than anyone expected. The playbook hadn't failed. It had simply been outpaced. And once that happens, coaching isn't about control anymore. It's about survival, for the player, for the team, and for the person tasked with guiding someone whose mind lives a few beats ahead of reality. And the scariest part? This was still the early phase. The pressure was about to multiply. At some point, Caitlin Clark stopped being just a basketball player. She became a solution. And that sounds like praise, until you understand what it does to a person. Because once a team, a fan base, and an entire sport start treating you like the answer to everything, the game changes in ways no box score can explain. Every possession begins to mean more. Every mistake begins to feel louder. Every quiet stretch becomes a storyline. And Caitlin felt all of it. Not because anyone sat her down and said, "This is all on you," but because she could see it. She saw the way teammates looked for her when things stalled. She saw the way opponents designed entire nights around disrupting her rhythm. She saw the way Iowa's identity became inseparable from her presence. That kind of awareness doesn't come from ego. It comes from responsibility. And responsibility, when layered onto brilliance, can quietly suffocate it. What fans didn't see were the mental loops, the constant replaying of possessions, the instinct to self-correct before anyone else could, the pressure to be perfect not because perfection was demanded, but because anything less felt like letting people down. That's where the burden begins. Caitlin wasn't just chasing greatness anymore. She was trying to hold it. And holding something that big requires energy most people don't realize they're spending until it's gone. Bluder started noticing the signs. Not dramatic ones. Not blow-ups or confrontations. Subtle ones. The way Caitlin stayed longer after practice. Not to shoot, but to think. The way she studied film not just to learn, but to solve. The way she carried herself during losses, quieter than before, heavier. When a player starts internalizing everything, that's when coaching becomes something else entirely. You're no longer asking, "How do I make her better?" You're asking, "How do I stop her from carrying too much?" Because the irony of generational talent is that the better you are, the more invisible your struggle becomes. People assume confidence where there's calculation. They assume joy where there's obligation. They assume swagger where there's weight. Caitlin wasn't overwhelmed by the game. She was overwhelmed by the expectations wrapped around it. Every logo 3 wasn't just a highlight, it was confirmation. Every assist wasn't just a read, it was responsibility. And the more she delivered, the more was expected. That's the trap. Because success doesn't relieve pressure. It compounds it. Bluder understood that coaching Caitlin wasn't about correcting mistakes anymore. It was about preventing collapse. And collapse doesn't always look like failure. Sometimes it looks like pushing through exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like doing too much for too long. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let yourself breathe. Caitlin didn't want to let anyone down. Not her teammates, not her coaches, not the fans who packed arenas just to watch her exist. And that desire is dangerous. Because it convinces you that rest is weakness. That simplicity is laziness. That letting go is betrayal. Bluder could see Caitlin trying to be everything at once. The scorer, the playmaker, the emotional anchor, the answer. And no player, no matter how gifted, can carry that without consequence. This is where the phrase "impossible to coach" takes on its real meaning. You can't coach someone out of caring too much. You can't diagram a solution to emotional overload. You can't bench responsibility. The only thing you can do is change the environment. And Bluder knew that if she didn't, the very qualities that made Caitlin historic would slowly hollow her out. Because greatness doesn't ask for permission before it becomes heavy. It just keeps piling on. And Caitlin was running out of room to carry it all. That's when Bluder made a decision that went against everything she'd learned over decades on the sidelines. Instead of tightening control, she started letting it go. And that choice would change everything. There's a moment every great coach fears. The moment when you realize the biggest threat to your best player isn't the opponent. It's the player themselves. Lisa Bluder didn't come to that realization all at once. It arrived in pieces. Small observations that didn't mean much on their own, but together formed a picture she couldn't ignore. Caitlin wasn't burning out physically. She was burning too brightly mentally. The signs weren't dramatic. They never are. They were quiet and persistent. A player who couldn't stop thinking. A competitor who replayed possessions long after they ended. A leader who felt responsible not just for outcomes, but for process, for every decision, every angle, every moment. Caitlin wasn't satisfied with winning. She was trying to master chaos. And that's where the danger lived. Because when a player sees everything, they start believing they have to fix everything. And once that belief takes root, it doesn't matter how talented you are, it will eat at you. Bluder understood something most fans never consider. Coaching isn't just about maximizing ability. It's about managing cost. Every style of play extracts a price. Every role demands something in return. And Caitlin's role was demanding everything, mentally, emotionally, and eventually spiritually. She was carrying the offense. She was carrying the pace. She was carrying the narrative. And she was doing it because she could. But just because you can carry something doesn't mean you should. That's when Bluder's mindset shifted. She stopped asking how to coach Caitlin's game. She started asking how to protect Caitlin from the parts of herself that never shut off. Because Caitlin's instincts were relentless. They didn't rest between possessions. They didn't pause in timeouts. They didn't sleep. And instincts like that don't come with an off switch. Caitlin didn't know how to play halfway. She didn't know how to see less. She didn't know how to let mistakes exist without trying to erase them immediately. And Bluder knew something painful was coming if that continued. You can't ask a player to stop caring. But you can change the environment so caring doesn't destroy them. That realization led to the hardest coaching paradox of Bluder's career. To save Caitlin's brilliance, she had to stop controlling it. Which sounds reckless. Because coaches are trained to organize, to reduce uncertainty, to impose order, to make the game easier when pressure rises. Bluder did the opposite. She leaned into uncertainty. She started loosening the reins, not by abandoning structure entirely, but by making space for imperfection. Because perfection had become Caitlin's prison, and the only way out was to make failure acceptable. That meant fewer rigid reads, more freedom to feel, more room to make the wrong play without consequences. Not because Caitlin needed less accountability, but because she needed relief. Bluder realized Caitlin didn't need someone to sharpen her instincts. She needed someone to absorb the weight of them. And that's not something coaching manuals teach. Because how do you tell a generational player that doing less might actually make them more effective? How do you convince someone whose entire identity is built on excellence that being human won't erase their greatness? That's what made Caitlin impossible to coach. Not stubbornness. Not ego. Not defiance. Intensity without boundaries. An intensity like that, when left unchecked, doesn't break in obvious ways. It fractures quietly. Bluder knew she had to intervene before that happened. So she did something that looked insane from the outside. Instead of simplifying the game for Caitlin, she introduced chaos. Not reckless chaos. Intentional chaos. Because chaos, when controlled, does something structure can't. It forces instinct to play instead of perform. And what happened next would redefine Iowa basketball and reveal the side of Caitlin Clark fans never knew existed. The system was about to change, and nobody was ready for what it unlocked. From the outside, it looked like Iowa loosened up. From the inside, it felt like the floor dropped out. Because the moment Lisa Bluder stopped trying to control every outcome, everything about the program began to feel unfamiliar, especially to the people who had built it. This wasn't a minor tweak. This wasn't a new set or wrinkle. It was a philosophical pivot. Bluder started designing an environment where the plan was allowed to break. Practices became less scripted. Possessions became less predictable. Some drills no longer had a correct answer. The goal wasn't execution, it was reaction. And for a coaching staff that had spent decades refining structure, this felt borderline irresponsible. Assistants worried it would spiral. Teammates worried it would get sloppy. From the outside, it would have looked like Iowa was abandoning discipline. But inside, something else was happening. Caitlin changed first. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But subtly. She stopped trying to solve every possession before it started. She stopped gripping the game so tightly. She began trusting that the right decision didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to exist. That shift alone altered everything. Because once Caitlin stopped feeling responsible for every outcome, the team breathed. Spacing improved. Movement flowed. Players stopped hesitating, waiting for Caitlin to rescue a possession, and started playing with her instead of around her. That's the difference no stat can capture. Playing around a star is survival. Playing with a star is freedom. Bluder didn't remove accountability. She redistributed it. Instead of Caitlyn being the answer to every problem, the system encouraged everyone to make decisions, to fail safely, to exist without fear of breaking something. And ironically, that made Caitlyn even more dangerous. Because when you remove the weight of perfection, instinct gets lighter. She still took deep shots. She still made audacious passes. She still bent defenses until they snapped. But now, those moments came from flow, not obligation. That's when Iowa's offense started looking different. Not simpler, not safer, more alive. Defenses couldn't key in on tendencies because tendencies stopped being rigid. Scouting reports grew thicker, but less useful. Opponents prepared for patterns that no longer stayed consistent. And Caitlyn thrived in that space. Because chaos was where she'd always lived. She just hadn't been allowed to admit it. Bluder's gamble began paying off in the only way that matters. The team started winning together. Not just because Caitlyn was great, but because everyone felt involved, trusted, and empowered. And here's the dangerous part. It worked so well that it invited a new kind of pressure. When something breaks convention and succeeds, people start watching closer. The media began questioning Iowa's lack of structure. Analysts debated whether this style could survive March. Critics whispered that Bluder had lost control. But inside the locker room, the players felt something rare. Relief. Caitlyn wasn't carrying the game anymore. She was inhabiting it. And that distinction matters more than anyone realizes. Because performing drains you. Playing sustains you. Bluder had found the balance point. Not by forcing Caitlyn into a system, but by shaping a system flexible enough to hold her. But there was a problem no one could ignore. March was coming. And March doesn't reward freedom unless it survives pressure. Because chaos, when tested at the highest level, either evolves or collapses. And the postseason was about to decide which one Iowa had built. What came next would test not just Caitlyn's talent, but whether this entire experiment could survive when everything was on the line. March doesn't test talent. It tests exposure. By the time Iowa reached the postseason, Caitlyn Clark was no longer just a star. She was a case study. Every coach in the country had watched the film. Every analyst had broken down her tendencies. Every opponent came in with one priority. Disrupt Caitlyn Clark first, then figure out everything else later. And that's when the game stopped being about basketball. Because the deeper Iowa went, the less teams tried to outplay Caitlyn, and the more they tried to break her rhythm. Defenses stopped reacting and started anticipating. Help defenders showed earlier. Traps came faster. Bodies leaned into her on every cut, every drive, every catch. Hands were always there. Voices were always close. Not trash talk, something more calculated. Little comments. Lingering contact. Constant reminders of pressure. You're carrying a lot tonight. Everyone's watching you. Don't force it. Those tactics aren't designed to stop your shot. They're designed to get inside your head. And for most players, that works. But Caitlyn wasn't most players. She had already lived inside pressure for years. The difference now was that she wasn't gripping it anymore. And that confused everyone. Because opponents expected frustration. They expected force. They expected Caitlyn to respond by trying to do too much, to pull up deeper, drive harder, impose herself louder. Instead, she did something that made scouting reports useless. She trusted. She moved the ball early. She let possessions breathe. She allowed the game to come to her. And that terrified defenses. Because when you prepare for control and get freedom, there's nothing to guard. Opponents would sell out to take away her shot, and suddenly she was carving them up with passes. They'd crowd her airspace, and she'd pull defenders out of position without touching the ball. She wasn't forcing greatness anymore. She was letting it happen. But the mental toll didn't disappear. It just changed shape. Because now Caitlyn wasn't just fighting opponents. She was fighting the weight of expectation that comes with March. Every miss felt amplified. Every turnover felt magnified. Every quiet stretch invited speculation. And yet, something inside her had shifted. She didn't panic. She didn't spiral. She didn't tighten. She accepted uncertainty. And that acceptance made her dangerous in a new way. Bluder could see it from the sideline. Timeouts became quieter. Instructions became simpler. Sometimes they didn't say much at all. Because Caitlyn didn't need answers anymore. She needed trust. And trust is terrifying in March. Because when it works, you look like a genius. When it fails, it looks like negligence. Bluder leaned into it anyway. Because pulling back now would undo everything they'd built. Opponents kept trying to escalate. Physicality increased. Pressure mounted. The noise got louder. And Caitlin kept responding the same way. Not with defiance. With calm. That calm unnerved people. Because calm under that kind of heat isn't normal. It's learned. And Caitlin had learned it the hard way. By carrying too much for too long and finally letting some of it go. But March has a way of exposing the cost no matter how prepared you think you are. Because when the lights get brighter, even controlled chaos demands something in return. And Caitlin was about to pay that price, not on the scoreboard, but in a way nobody could see coming. The deeper Iowa went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a tournament run. It was a collision between freedom and fatigue. And the next moment would force Bluder to confront the scariest question of all. What happens when your player survives the pressure, but starts disappearing into it? When the season finally ended, the noise didn't. The cameras stayed on. The debates got louder. The expectations doubled. From the outside, it looked like validation. Everything Caitlin Clark had done at Iowa had been proven right. The system worked. The freedom paid off. The program reached heights it had never touched before. But inside the building, something felt off. Because when the adrenaline faded, what remained wasn't celebration. It was exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from running out of gas in your legs, but the kind that settles behind your eyes, the kind that makes silence feel heavy instead of peaceful. Bluder noticed it immediately. Caitlin wasn't sad. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frustrated. She was empty. That's the part people don't talk about when they talk about greatness. They assume the end of the journey brings relief, closure, satisfaction. But sometimes it brings something else entirely. A quiet question you don't know how to answer yet. Who am I when the game finally stops? Caitlin had spent years operating at a frequency most people never touch. Reading, reacting, anticipating, carrying. Even when she learned to let go during games, her mind never truly shut down. Because once you've trained yourself to see everything, you don't just stop seeing. Bluder realized the job wasn't done just because the season was over. In some ways, it had only just begun. The truth was uncomfortable. Coaching Caitlin through games had been easier than coaching her through the aftermath. Because there were no opponents now. No scouting reports. No possessions to fix. Just space. And space is dangerous for people who don't know how to rest inside it. Caitlin had lived in intensity for so long that normal felt foreign. Quiet felt wrong. Downtime felt undeserved. That's when Bluder understood something that shook her. Caitlin hadn't just been playing basketball. She had been surviving it. And survival mode doesn't turn off automatically. It lingers. It convinces you that stillness is weakness. That ease is laziness. That if you stop moving, something bad will happen. Bluder could see Caitlin searching for the next thing to conquer, the next standard to meet, the next version of herself to outgrow. And that scared her more than any box-and-one defense ever could. Because no coach wants to be the one who pushes a player past the point where greatness stops being a gift and starts becoming a trap. Bluder had spent decades preparing athletes for competition. Nothing had prepared her for helping one come back from it. That's when she began reflecting, not just on Caitlin, but on herself. On what it meant to guide someone whose ceiling you could never touch. On what it meant to step back at the right time instead of clinging to control. Because the hardest part of coaching isn't pushing players forward. It's knowing when to stop. Bluder's decision to step away from coaching didn't come from burnout alone. It came from understanding that the game was changing, and so was her role in it. She had helped Caitlin unlock something extraordinary. Now, someone else would have to help her live with it. And that realization carried a strange peace. Because Bluder didn't see Caitlin as unfinished. She saw her as someone who had survived the weight of being impossible. And that's not something you celebrate loudly. It's something you respect quietly. But the story doesn't end there. Because Caitlin Clark's journey didn't just reshape Iowa. It forced an entire sport to confront a question it still isn't ready to answer. What do we do with players who outgrow the systems meant to protect them? And that question still hangs in the air today. The easiest way to understand Caitlin Clark's time at Iowa is through numbers. Points, assists, wins, crowds. But numbers don't explain why this story still lingers, why coaches, players, and fans keep coming back to it long after the season ended. Because Caitlin didn't just dominate games. She exposed something uncomfortable about how we treat greatness. We love impossible players. We celebrate them. We market them. We build narratives around them. But we rarely ask what it costs to become that person, or what happens once they do. Caitlin Clark forced that conversation without ever saying a word. She showed what happens when a player's mind outruns the systems designed to guide them. When instinct moves faster than instruction. When responsibility grows faster than relief. And Lisa Bluder's honesty cracked the illusion. Because impossible to coach doesn't mean ungrateful or rebellious. It means the job stops being about basketball. It becomes about restraint, about protection, about knowing when to step back instead of pushing forward. Caitlin didn't need to be taught how to play. She needed someone who understood when not to interfere. That lesson matters now more than ever. Because Caitlin's stage is only getting bigger. More attention, more pressure, more expectations wrapped in praise. And the world is watching to see whether she'll keep redefining the game, or whether the weight that once made her impossible will return in a different form. The story of Caitlin Clark at Iowa isn't a fairy tale. It's a warning wrapped in brilliance. A reminder that generational talent doesn't just break records, it breaks assumptions. About leadership, about control, about what coaching is supposed to look like. And maybe that's why this era feels different. Because Caitlin didn't just ask defenders to guard deeper. She asked everyone around her to think deeper. About how we nurture greatness. About how we protect it. About how we let extraordinary people remain human. Lisa Bluder didn't walk away from coaching because she failed. She walked away having learned something most never do. That the hardest players to coach aren't the ones who resist instruction. They're the ones who outgrow it. And that's why Caitlin Clark's story still isn't finished. If you want more real stories like this, the ones that happen behind the highlights, behind the quotes, behind the headlines everyone repeats, make sure you subscribe. Because the next chapter of women's basketball isn't just about talent. It's about pressure, power, and what happens when the game grows faster than the people inside it.